Hello and welcome to American Stories. I'm Saida Pagan. Our guest today is Laura Flanders. She is the host and executive producer of Laura Flanders and Friends. It is a show which airs on over 300 public broadcasting stations, public radio, podcasts, and various streaming platforms. Laura is a best-selling author, and she's also an award-winning journalist whose reporting has been described as aspiring to shift power, seed bold ideas, and offer the public a way forward that is about transformative change. Thank you so much for joining us, Laura.
Oh, Saida, it's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Yes, now you've heard how others perceive the mission of your show. How would you describe what you do on your show?
Well, we say it's a TV and radio program where the people who say it can't be done take a back seat to the people who are doing it. So we report on models of change making, positive change making in the worlds of arts, politics, and economics.
What kind of changes are you referring to then? Tell me about it. Just an
Well,
alternative point of view?
I think a lot of people are getting a lot of critique from their mainstream media, whether it's critique of politicians or critique of the economy or critique of, I don't know, the weather. And I think what we're trying to say is we need to go beyond critiquing what is to considering what might be an improvement upon what is. And beyond just thinking about that, reporting on any models that exist that perhaps might point a way to the future or have existed in the past that are worth reminding ourselves of. I think in general, my sense is our job is to kind of expand the envelope, push the envelope, if you will, of the possible, giving people a sense of the options that are before them are way bigger than we're often presented. Is it just Democrat versus Republican, more tax cuts versus fewer? What else could we be thinking about about when it comes to how we improve our lives and those of our families and our communities? So that's how we try to think about it. And insofar as possible, that's what steers our reporting. I won't say we entirely avoid the critical thinking that comes with just looking around at what's happening in our world today. Obviously, we do a good amount of that. But I think our priority is trying to sort of even the balance, even the diet, so that you get the critique, but you also get some suggestions, if you will.
So, to give us a better idea of what you do, how would you compare your show to some of the traditional media shows? I know you just decided to give us a little bit of an idea, but thinking back on it, what's the difference?
Well, thanks for asking. I've worked in all sorts of media, whether it's independent, community and radio, really bottom-up grassroots kind of a thing, or commercial talk radio. I did my share with Air America Radio, and I've been a pundit on MSNBC and CNN over the years. So I've got a good sense of how these different media worlds operate. And frankly, this sounds like a small thing, but it is huge. The biggest difference you get when you tune into our program is you get almost half an hour of uninterrupted programming, which is to say, not programming that has to fit in between commercial breaks. And that's not true of pretty much any mainstream media outlet that you can think of. And to have to program between commercials, well, just on the face of it, the format means that it's very hard to get into a complete or complex thought about something. It's hard to carry a narrative over any kind of extent of time. It makes you think and operate in sound bites. And then there are the questions of what do advertisers want or not want as lead-ins to their ads. So even if you're just not thinking censorship or the interests of the marketing department and you're just thinking format, I think we're very different. And then there's other differences as well. I mean, I think one of the great freedoms of being an independent producer is that you get to determine your priorities. And looking around again at the mainstream media diet, it seems to me that Washington is pretty well covered. So we tend to prioritize reporting that is not simply driven by beltway politics and sort of, the horse race of our political races, and instead to try to do our best to bring people a sense of a broader environment, a broader horizon for possibility, for reporting. And that means we go out of the city, we go out of the studio, but it also means we don't simply cover, for example, the electoral cycle.
Do you feel that certainly we know that for years advertisers have had a say on what goes on the air? So, do you believe that in today's very divisive political climate, that stations have even been more limited than in the past?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the biggest change that I've seen in my lifetime, and that would be yours too, I think, Saida, is this commercialization of news. Until the late 1980s, the news divisions of our networks were immunized from having to get the same ratings as entertainment. It was considered part of the public interest function of those license carriers, those license holders. Don't forget, the public airwaves are publicly owned, limited resource. The license to broadcast is granted to station holders and those who team up to become networks on the basis that they will provide a public service. It was until the 90s considered a public service news. So news didn't have to have ratings to please the advertisers. It was understood that the funds were fungible and what you made on the advertising, on the entertainment side, would help underwrite the news. That all changed with CNN and Fox News, and we began to see as early as the first Gulf War a commercial requirement mandate even over the news departments. So indeed, I mean, we haven't even gotten into the substance of things, but the requirement to have high ratings, to have your ratings be reviewed after every show, that is something that I think has been with us for a while to really detrimental effect. And then today, absolutely. I think there is a chill effect in the biggest, most powerful networks because their corporate leaders don't want them to run afoul of the powers that be in Washington, D.C., who clearly have their eye on news media as a enemy of the people. Remember that phrase, drawing itself back from Hitlerian years, heaven help us. Um, the the target is clearly on the backs of the broadcasters because they're advertisers and the corporate owners are very scared of the wrath of the government. So yeah, I'm afraid I'm thinking everything is getting much, much more tense, shall we say, for both the owners of the networks as institutions and the people that are employed there.
Obviously, a show like yours is very important for people to get a different point of view. Your show has been on, I believe, about 4 to 4.5 years. Is that correct?
Well, we're actually about to enter our sixth season. For about 4 years, we were called the Laura Flanders Show. And then for the last two, it's been Laura Flanders and Friends as we bring on more correspondents and co-hosts and sort of expand the cast of characters you'll meet with us on a regular basis. But we're entering our sixth season, independently funded on public television. It's an amazing privilege to be able to do this work.
Absolutely. Now, question for you. Let's walk us through some of your most memorable episodes in that time period so that we get a better idea and a better understanding of what you do. Tell us about
Oh
that.
my, I mean, I don't know about you, Saida, but it is sometimes hard for me to remember what I did yesterday. So I don't know if I can promise to bring you our greatest hits of the last 6 years. But I will say that we were very pleased at the end of the last season to bring Jamie Raskin into our into conversation for the full half hour. Now here is somebody who constitutional rights scholar, somebody who people know from the impeachment hearings of Donald Trump, who led one of the congressional investigations into the January 6th uprising. You've heard from him, but I feel that what we were able to get into with him, because we had the longer format of the full half hour or 25 minutes or so, was a lot deeper. And we even got into discussions of him and his father. His father was somebody who also worked in politics, somebody who had worked in the Kennedy administration, who then went on to work outside of Congress and helped to co-found a policy institute called the Institute for Policy Studies. Became involved in the Pentagon Papers, had a real activist life, and to have a chance to talk to Raskin about how he reflects on his father's record and its connections to his own, obviously, as an elected official, his career. I just think you could see he turned into he went onto a different wavelength, more personal, more thoughtful in a way. So we heard all the strident stuff about what's happening in Congress and his determination to defend the Constitution at all costs. But then you also heard how he thinks about his work in relationship to his father. So that seemed to me like a greatest hit, kind of personalizing, humanizing somebody people have certainly seen in sound bites, but I think bringing him into people's living rooms with much more dimension. So that's one example. I mean, other examples I think of is the series of reporting that we have done in North Carolina, investigative reporting over the last 4 years, looking at the roots of the January 6th insurrection in just one state. And looking at what else was going on in that state. So we did a story about the growth of private for-profit paramilitary facilities in North Carolina and the connection of at least one of those to some of those who went to Washington on January 6, 2021. And in one county, we could see that this private facility was operating more or less without any oversight, making life pretty hellish for the people who lived nearby, who were disproportionately African American, low income folks who had no idea what they were getting into when they agreed to have a firing range in their backyard. And then in the next door county, people who had worked for many years to elect socially responsible, responsive electeds to their town board, and who had been able to stop the expansion of one of these private facilities. So we did what we like to be able to do, which is to say, here's a problem in one place, but here's a right next door place that was able to address this problem. This is how they did it. They did it through enforcing zoning regulations, and bringing those two groups together on the screen actually, Saida, resulted in them coming together in real life, meeting with each other, and developing a kind of community response in the first place, inspired a little bit by what had happened in the second. So it's that kind of thing that I think makes me feel good, both in terms of our reporting, an important topic, but we go beyond the headlines, and its real life impact in the lives of people in the community where we are covering the story.
Going back to the Jamie Raskin interview, I know that he discussed the powers of the executive branch of government. Could you give us an idea of his thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, he believes that the courts and the Congress have equal power to the executive, and he's right. That's what's written right into the Constitution. So one of our questions was, what does he think could happen if the executive branch, if the Trump administration, the White House, the president's office, simply refuses to abide by the rulings of the courts? And people have been talking about this. What he talked about on our program was the importance of popular mobilization, because in addition to those three branches of government, we the people. So he said, the heat in the underbrush, the heat in the communities, the heat in those town meetings, being raised by voters is another piece of the equation that can't be underestimated in its impact, both on the courts and the court of public opinion, and on the legislative branch. And those will be the two branches that hold the executive at bay. So there are people working in the executive branch who I think are also sensitive to what kind of responses they're finding and hearing and seeing in the public's arena. So I think that was what I took away from that interview, was sure, he's looking at the Constitution, but he's remembering that in addition to everything written down there on paper, there's people power.
Now, some other important reporting that you have done recently, and we talked about that the last time we spoke, was about Selma, Alabama, the 60th anniversary of the Civil Rights March across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Could you tell us what you found as you went out there?
Well, the 60th anniversary of this landmark civil rights march, the march from Selma to Montgomery, and the beating that those marchers sustained on their first attempt to get across that bridge, I felt was a worthy national story for us because it reminds us of how change was made in America within 6 weeks after that uprising, that march. We saw LBJ, the president, sign the Rights Act into law. And so it in itself reminds us how change happens in this country. In going down to Selma, I found that the march was not just a commemoration, that the march was actually a convening of civil rights leaders and others committing themselves, recommitting themselves, if you will, to the agenda of that 1965 movement, which was for voting rights, it was for economic rights, it was for realizing the dream of American popular democracy. And it was indeed standing up against authoritarianism and saying, look, American history has both elements in it. It has the elements of the freedom riders and those who threw off autocracy or aristocracy, the monarchy and the revolution. It also has those who sustained segregation and sustained slavery in this country, slavery which as James Baldwin said, was plenty of an experience to inform African Americans about what fascism is. And in fact, we know now from history that the Nazis sent people to segregated slave-owning states of the United States to learn a lot about how segregation was enforced. So we have that history as well, that history of fascism. And so to come together in Selma and remember how significant change was made was super important, but also very sobering. When people talk about making America great again or returning America to its roots, it's a complicated story, America's roots. I choose to think that the balance is on the positive, that we have seen this country go from much worse to much better. But, while I would love to believe that Dr. King is right, that the arc of history tilts towards justice, as a journalist, I have to say, I don't think there's any guarantees. I think the arc of history can go all over the place. And we've seen forward and back and forward and back, and we're in one of those moments today. So, I mean, it was definitely inspiring to be there. Many people were sad to feel that they were fighting for rights they had fought for 60 years ago still. Others were afraid that the kind of violence that they thought they would never see again perhaps might be on the horizon. But I would say for the most part, coming together strengthened people's sense of both resolve and connectedness, community. And boy, I don't know about you, Saida, but every interview I have done in the last 6 months has come down to when I ask people, well, what do you think is the most useful thing for people to be doing at this moment? They say build community, connect with other people, break out of isolation. And it was also a great testament of that. It was also raining the whole time. So it tested everybody's commitment and they came out roses for sure.
Thank you for that journalism. Now, question about how you began. We want to talk about your family and your career. You describe your family as being Anglo-American and that you come from a long line of journalists and performers. So tell us about how it all began for you, Laura.
Well, it's true. My mother's side of the family are, well, my mother's mother was an Iowa stock woman born at the turn of the last century, and came into Washington, D.C. as a journalist, as a writer, as somebody who worked for the agriculture department actually in the 1930s, and had my mother as a single mom, raising her on her own in Washington in those years. My father was a performer, had sustained polio in World War II, but had nonetheless gone on to have a very successful stage career. And my mother and my father met in through various connections in New York, and I came around about a year later. The family on both sides has performers, but on my mother's side, the her parental line, her father's line, many of them journalists. In fact, her father, my grandfather, was a groundbreaking radical journalist of the 1930s out of the UK. So I'm sort of mid-Atlantic somewhere. I came to this country in the early 1980s. I was supposed to be here for 6 months, and I went to and fro a bit. My first reporting was in Northern Ireland, but essentially I've made my home here ever since.
And tell us about the books that you've written. I believe it's six or going on seven.
Well, I haven't had a chance to write a book in a very long time, but it's true. I've written a few. I started as a media critic, in fact. I worked with the media watch group FAIR, and the first book that I wrote was called Real Majority Media Minority: The Cost of Sidelining Women in Reporting. And it was really about what happens to the story when you leave out women. And leave out any kind of gender lens. I then went on to write a book about the women inside the Bush administration, going back to George W. Bush, and talking a bit about how he peopled his cabinet with people who looked diverse and female, but were actually often a smokescreen for very conservative policies. But because of the failures of our media, many of the mainstream reporters who were covering the Bush cabinet had a hard time really communicating the politics of some of these people because they were so besotted, if you will, by the fact that he had women and people like Condoleezza Rice, look, as Secretary of State. So it was also looking at kind of the cost we pay, the price we pay for sexism and racism in reporting. And then my other book was the most more recent, the most of those. The book that followed those was a book about achieving the impossible, really, in American politics and how grassroots activists often do politics better than the elected politicians. So that was called Blue Grit, taking true Democrats take back politics from the politicians. And it was really, it stemmed from my years at Air America Radio, which was a radio channel targeting progressive Democrats. And it was trying to speak to those who felt just devastated by the loss of John Kerry in the election of 2006. And making the point that gains were won around the country even as the presidency was lost. How did those gains happen? How did we win things like increased minimum wages, improved rights and rights for women and people of color, voting rights, you name it? How do we actually change the condition of our lives? It isn't always coming from the top down from the president. It's often from the bottom up. So I profiled some of those stories and what we could learn from them.
A few final questions. You've done some tremendous reporting. What's next for you? What are some stories that you would like to cover in the future?
Well, I think this year is going to be all about looking at our democracy and whether, although we feel that it is under tremendous stress and perhaps broken in these times to have brought us to this place, whether this crisis, the crisis that so many are feeling, whether this crisis could actually generate the next great iteration of this nation's democracy. If the resistance is broad-based enough, far-thinking enough, sophisticated enough, and comes up with enough clarity of an alternative, we might find ourselves with an alternative that actually, I don't mean an alternative to democracy, but we might find ourselves with a more functional democracy with more people engaged coming out of this year and the next. And I think that that's the question I have in my mind. We're clear of how terribly this could all go, but maybe there's another side to the story that hasn't been written yet, and we're going to be watching that.
Now, let's talk about the fact that while there are many, many people who are concerned at this moment, there are others who believe that we're on the right track. What would you say to that? How would you explain that? Because, the election happened and we know the election results. So maybe we
Well,
can discuss
this
that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, there is no question that politics in this country, as reported by our mainstream media, and I do think our media representation of politics is a huge part of the problem. The way that we cover our electeds is only ever in election cycles, only ever competing with one another. We get very little coverage of what's actually happening at the state houses, what's happening in town hall meetings, the kind of constituent services that Congress people of right and left actually provide to their voters gets so little attention that it's no surprise that a lot of people just tune out of the process altogether, watch what happens on TV, maybe vote once every 4 years. And if that's the case, well, no wonder they feel pretty frustrated because there seems to be very little that's been getting done, a lot of money that's getting spent, and they're not really feeling the change in their lives. So I think that coupled with the partisan media that riles people up to hate people who are different from themselves, that's been a big part of the problem that we've been facing. I would say on the right more than the left, but there's problems on the left too. At this time, it's no surprise that people voted for change, no question. The question is, did they vote for the kind of change that they're seeing? And I think that that's the question that reporters have to be looking at now, not just how people feel, but what is actually happening. So, are the mass layoffs of federal workers actually bringing down the cost of government, the cost of living? How much is all of this motivated by a desire to reduce taxes on the very wealthy? Or how much is it really to get government out of our hair? What role do those federal agencies play that have seen such massive cuts to their budget over the last few weeks? What were they actually doing? I mean, in a way, this is an opportunity for us to sort of reintroduce the American public to what it is their government does, from inspecting food and water quality to making sure that our workplaces and our schools are healthy. I think that these are incredibly important times for our journalists. And the big sorrow for me would be if we only cover the individuals, if we only cover Donald Trump, if we only cover Elon Musk, we won't be addressing what you just raised, Saida, which is people, how people have been feeling and thinking about themselves and their role in the society, what drove them to make the decisions that they did in November. And let's not forget all the people that continue not to participate in our electoral process. Why is that? And what needs to change?
So many questions. Well, I want to thank you so much, Laura, for joining us today and giving us your perspective on many, many important issues of our time.
Well, I thank you, Said. And I think what people will find when they watch the show is we do tell stories of the change makers who live where you live, who are in your backyard. We try to remind people to look around as well as up and down. Look around at who's out there. I think it's usually a bit more of a heart-warming picture than you might suspect. So thanks. I know that you bring a lot of heart to what you do. I really appreciate your work, Saida, and your generosity, and it's been great being here with you today.
Thanks again. And thank you for joining us for this edition of American Stories. I'm Saida Pagan.